Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. When Bai Xiaochun saw the mountain of Tao essence preparing to crush him out of existence, he decided to throw caution to the wind. Even though his fleshly body power had not yet fully recovered, he unhesitatingly unleashed every bit of it he could muster. His right hand clenched into a fist, and he unleashed his undying sovereign's fist. The shadowy figure behind him connected to him, and a massive fist strike slammed into the enormous mountain of Tao essence. A deafening boom echoed out as the mighty mountain shivered, cracks spreading out across its surface from the point of impact. However, Bai Xiaochun did not come out unharmed. He coughed up 4 successive mouthfuls of blood, and his right arm was twisted at an odd angle as he was sent flying backward like a kite with its string cut. Even this weakened version of the worldly Taoist was still a sovereign, and was matchlessly powerful. In the end, though, Bai Xiaochun's attack was so powerful that the mountain of Tao essence eventually crumbled under the force of the blow. And yet, even as the mountain collapsed, a tower flew out from the rubble, a tower filled with black and white mist that pulsed with the Tao essence fluctuations of life and death. Bai Xiaochun's pupils constricted, aware that those streams of mist were the worldly Taoist's essence of life and death. "Water swamp," he shouted, not holding anything back as he threw all of his cultivation base power into the divine ability. Even as his words echoed out, the area around him filled with water vapor, which spread out rapidly to create a huge swamp. The mist that was the essence of life and death was contained within the swamp, and seemed to react to it, and even the worldly Taoist's eyes flickered with a strange light as he looked over at Bai Xiaochun. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun uttered the final word of the technique. "Kingdom." A beastly roar echoed out from the swamp, ferocious and threatening to an indescribable degree. Even the barrier behind the worldly Taoist began to twist and distort in response to it. Mountain-like spikes began to rise out of the swamp, followed by a huge landmass. Within moments, it became a scaled, clawed hand, dripping with black fluid, which first reached up, then slammed down onto the ground. Things weren't over yet. Another clawed hand appeared, which also rose high up and then slammed down onto the ground, opposite the other hand. Bai Xiaochun was located behind the 2 clawed hands. From his perspective, there appeared to be something missing from the water swamp kingdom, right in the middle. And it was from that location that, all of a sudden, he heard the roar of his life essence spirit, which was apparently struggling to crawl out into the open. It had been waiting for this day for a long time, and as its 2 hands struggled to pull its snout out into the open, the land around it quaked. However, that was when the strange light in the worldly Taoist's eyes grew even more intense. Quickly performing an incantation gesture, he caused the essence of life and death to form 2 swords, one black, one white, which subsequently slashed toward the 2 clawed hands. The black sword which represented death stabbed into one of the hands, causing it to wither rapidly, as though it were dying. As for the white sword which represented life, it was shoving so much life force into the hand that the hand seemed incapable of accepting it, and was about to explode. The power of the 2 swords brought intense pain, as well as a roar of unprecedented rage from Bai Xiaochun's life essence spirit, which was just about to appear in the open. Then, in a scene which Bai Xiaochun would never be able to forget, the lands began to crumble as an incomparably large head burst out into the open, a head so large that the world of the energy passageway didn't seem capable of containing it. It looked like a dragon, and also like a turtle. It was pitch black, its gaping maw filled with mountain-like fangs that made it resemble a crocodile. Unleashing a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering roar, it reached down and gobbled up the 2 swords. The essence swords were incapable of evading, and were swallowed up. Then, the head of the enormous life essence spirit lunged forward and crashed into the barrier protecting the Dantian region. Everything shook violently, and began to crack and crumble, even the barrier. In fact, a huge opening had been punched into it. However, the impact was too much for the life essence spirit to bear. Letting out an agonized shriek, it shrank back, disappearing into the swamp, which then faded away of its own accord. It all happened too quickly, leaving Bai Xiaochun standing there with wide eyes. Although he couldn't be sure, it almost seemed like his life essence spirit had been too eager to attack, and in its rashness had killed itself accidentally. Wait, is it a crocodile? However, there was no time for him to sit around thinking about his life essence spirit. Blurring into motion, he shot toward the hole that had opened up in the barrier, and prepared to enter the Dantian region. Before he could reach it, though, the worldly Taoist suddenly blurred into nothing, then reappeared right in front of him. Reaching out with his right hand, he calmly said, "You shall not pass." "Like hell I won't," Bai Xiaochun roared. He had no disrespect for the worldly Taoist. He just knew that the person in front of him wasn't really the worldly Taoist. Furthermore, he was in a big rush. Anger flaring, he called upon an Archean-level magic of which he had gained enlightenment after gaining the chi flow of the immortal world. Immortal world, he shouted. In the blink of an eye, his cultivation base power was almost completely depleted. At the same time, he drew upon the chi flow of the immortal world to fuel a magical technique that summoned an illusory version of the ruins of the immortal world. They were enormous and at the same time, profoundly ancient. The aura of the immortal world was clearly present, and without even a pause, it crushed down on the worldly Taoist. The area around the worldly Taoist began to sink down as the ruins acted like sand, burying him and binding him in place. For the first time, the worldly Taoist's expression flickered. As he looked around at the ruins of the immortal world which were burying him, his eyes went blank. And it was in that moment of blankness that Bai Xiaochun used the last bit of energy he had to enter the Dantian region. As he did, the bloodline power within him surged, creating a dazzling light that all the cultivators down in the eternal immortal domains could see. Then, the ceiling strip that went from the mortal renegade's forehead all the way down to his Dantian began to glow. As its power built up, it became like a huge net that stretched out to cover the struggling sovereign and bind him tight. The people of the eternal immortal domains had only recently watched the Saint Emperor's bloodline ceiling strip shatter. But now, Bai Xiaochun had repaired the Arch-Ancestor's bloodline ceiling strip. As of this moment, one ceiling strip held strong, while the other two had been destroyed. The forehead represented divine sense, and the Dantian region represented the cultivation base. From that it could be seen that, years ago when the eternal sons had lived, the Arch-Ancestor was the strongest. That was why his bloodline ceiling strip covered the most important areas. Only recently, the mortal renegade had been struggling to open his eyes and awaken, to the point where his entire body trembled. But now that Bai Xiaochun had repaired the bloodline ceiling strip, struggle was not possible. The mortal renegade went still. At the same time, the bloodline ceiling strip teleported Bai Xiaochun back out into the open, where he appeared in the sky, just outside the body of the enormous sovereign. Instantly, cheers rose up from the countless cultivators who lived in the eternal immortal domains. Arch-Emperor, Arch-Emperor, Arch-Emperor. Cheering could be heard in the Vile Emperor dynasty, the Saint Emperor dynasty, and of course the Arch-Emperor dynasty. Although Bai Xiaochun had not spent a huge amount of time inside the sovereign's body, it was still a period in which all cultivators in the eternal immortal domains knew that their collective lives were on the line. If the legendary enemy from beyond woke up, everyone knew exactly what would happen as a result. At the moment, the Saint Emperor was breathing a huge sigh of relief, and looking at Bai Xiaochun with very mixed feelings. If it weren't for the enemy from beyond, he might have tried to take advantage of Bai Xiaochun's weakened state to take ultimate control of the eternal immortal domains. But now he could only chuckle bitterly and dismiss such thoughts. Taking a deep breath, he shot toward Bai Xiaochun. As Bai Xiaochun hovered there in the air, he could hear the cheering below, and could sense how grateful everyone was. However, he didn't take advantage of the situation to bask in his glory. He was simply feeling too much pressure for that kind of thing. After what he had experienced in the process of repairing the ceiling strip, he had come to a much clearer understanding of how incredibly powerful the mortal renegade was. The three eternal sons had been incapable of killing him, and in the end had sacrificed themselves simply to seal him. Even the worldly Taoist could do little more than hate him. Thus, as Bai Xiaochun looked up at the enormous sovereign looming above, his heart was filled with unease. Everything seemed different now. For one thing, the mortal renegade was now covered in countless cracks and crevices, which were the result of his struggle. Those cracks and crevices didn't exist on his body, but rather, on the extensive dust and stone that had built up on him over the years. It was even as Bai Xiaochun looked up uneasily that the Saint Emperor approached. The Saint Emperor could tell what was on his mind, and after a moment passed, quietly said, "One ceiling strip will keep the sovereign bound, but not for very long. At the most, it will last for half of a 60-year cycle." Because the Saint Emperor possessed the complete legacy of his bloodline, he was able to calculate the number accurately. In all of the eternal immortal domains, he was the only person who knew the truth. His words caused Bai Xiaochun's heart to begin to pound even more. He knew that the Saint Emperor wouldn't lie at a moment like this. They were now faced with a countdown, which would end with the mortal renegade waking up. Once he began to struggle, he would destroy the ceiling strip, and open his eyes. His voice filled with bitterness, the Saint Emperor continued, "If we can become sovereigns in half of a 60-year cycle, then maybe we have a chance. But if we can't, then our fate is easy to imagine. And there's nowhere for us to escape to." I'm guessing that the reason you became an Archean has nothing to do with the approval of the Eternal Mother. You must have come across some good fortune in the outside world, perhaps from that treasured fan. You've seen the void out there, haven't you? He sighed. Bai Xiaochun said nothing for a moment. Then, just as he was about to reply, and even as everyone in the eternal immortal domains was sighing in relief, something strange happened. A string of muffled booms could be heard as the shoulders of the sealed and unmoving mortal renegade began to crack and crumble, apparently due to the lack of the other two bloodline sealing strips. As the rubble fell downward, it became a cloud of meteorites, hurtling toward the surface of the eternal immortal domains. The smallest among them were the size of a person, while the largest were as big as mountains. All of them glowed with shocking black light that made them seem capable of piercing anything. Upon seeing them, the faces of both Bai Xiaochun and the Saint Emperor fell, and even as they prepared to go block the paths of the meteorites accelerated. Rumbling sounds could be heard as the meteorites smashed into the ground, causing blinding light to shine everywhere, seemingly preparing to bind the entire world. In the blink of an eye, more than 100 such world-binding meteorites landed within the territory of the three imperial dynasties. If that were all there were to it, it might not be a big deal. However, as the black light spread out, it began to absorb the life force from everything within its bounds. It was very similar to what had happened years ago in the Saint Emperor dynasty. Given the speed with which the black light spread, it wouldn't take very long before it covered all of the eternal immortal domains. And of course, all of the life force being absorbed would be sent into the body of the mortal renegade, giving him more strength to struggle against the sealing strip. We have to do something, now. Nearly in a panic, the Saint Emperor immediately began transmitting orders to his subordinates. Bai Xiaochun did the same. In response, the Celestials and demigods from both the Arch-Emperor dynasty and the Saint Emperor dynasty began to rush in the direction of the world-binding light. Because the Vile Emperor had perished, it was Prince Demon and the other Celestials who took the lead in the Vile Emperor dynasty. They didn't need any orders from Bai Xiaochun to mobilize the demigods and take action. Bai Xiaochun even went so far as to summon his 2 Archean slaves from the treasured fan, and sent them into the fray. All of the powers within the 3 great imperial dynasties were working together, joined by the 2 Archean slaves. As for Bai Xiaochun and the Saint Emperor, they found the most powerful areas of binding, and focused their efforts there. The Saint Emperor was shocked to see Bai Xiaochun's 2 Archean slaves, but at the same time, it suddenly bolstered his confidence in the eternal immortal domain's chances of surviving. He focused on a certain sprawling mountain peak that was under attack, whereas Bai Xiaochun headed toward the largest of the meteorites, which had fallen like an enormous island in the middle of the eternal sea. Bai Xiaochun was both anxious and exhausted. He had only just returned to the eternal immortal domains, only to be forced to rescue the giant ghost king, fight the imposter Vile Emperor, and then learn about the bloodline sealing strip on the mortal renegade being broken. After going through untold hardships to repair the sealing strip connected to his bloodline, the entire world came under threat. He was exhausted both physically and mentally, but had no choice but to pull himself together and fly out over the eternal sea. He didn't hesitate at all to use his undying hex to pick up speed. Piercing into the black area which had already been bound, he found himself in a node world. Shocked, he looked around at an area with no seawater and only black land. Off in the distance was a volcano, which had obviously been formed by the meteorite. The black smoke which belched out from that volcano was the very same darkness that was binding up the world. After sending out some divine sense, it was to his shock that he saw countless devilish specters lurking about. At the moment, it was impossible to say whether they were responsible for the spreading smoke, or whether the smoke was simply carrying them with it. As soon as the devilish specters saw Bai Xiaochun, they howled and began to charge toward him. These devilish specters were different from the shadowy specters in the body of the sovereign. It took only a moment for Bai Xiaochun to realize that they were actually vengeful souls. Bai Xiaochun had plenty of ways of dealing with souls. Breathing a sigh of relief, he waved his hand to produce a large quantity of soul convergence pills, which he then tossed out in front of him. If I had known that the mortal renegade had all these souls, then I wouldn't have gone out into the void. Flicking his sleeve, he proceeded onward into the desolate area ahead. Back when the mortal renegade exterminated all of the peoples of the starry sky, the resulting vengeful souls were sullied by his aura, and became these devilish specters, which had once been the terror of anyone who faced them in battle. Because they were already dead, they didn't fear being cut down in battle, and actually could not be exterminated without the use of spectacularly powerful divine abilities or magical techniques. Most other methods were useless against them. Only a few groups out in the starry sky had possessed divine abilities that could target soul bodies. Those were people that the mortal renegade had dealt with personally. For the most part, his grand army of devilish specters was his most deadly and terrifying weapon. Back when the three eternal sons sacrificed themselves to seal the mortal renegade, his army had been pulled inside of him, where they slept for countless years along with him. Now that the mortal renegade was beginning to wake up, so was his army of devilish specters. As bits and chunks of his flesh and blood fell down in the form of meteorites, they began to bind the world, spreading out slowly to cover all of the eternal immortal domains. At the same time, anyone who entered that area would quickly be devoured. However, now they had run into Bai Xiaochun. It was impossible to say how many souls Bai Xiaochun had captured in his life, and how many he had used in his necromancy. The number probably exceeded the current population of the eternal immortal domains. Plus, when you added in his journeys through the void, his fear of ghosts had turned into the exact opposite. Of all the things he feared in life, he feared ghosts the least. When he saw a whole horde of snarling, vicious devilish specters speeding toward him, he smiled. With the wave of his right hand, he sent out a whole collection of soul convergence pills, which exploded into vortexes that dragged the nearby specters toward them. The specters struggled, but were powerless to fight the forces dragging them toward the convergence spots. Now, they seemed weak and powerless, and could only howl as they were dragged into several dozen soul spheres. Each of those spheres contained innumerable specters, all of them howling and snapping at each other, struggling to get free. All of a sudden, Bai Xiaochun felt his weariness transforming into relaxation and even excitement. Blurring into motion, he began to collect soul spheres in one location after another. If only things had been this easy back in that energy passageway. Sighing, he collected up a whole set of soul spheres, and then looked around at the hordes of devilish specters still rushing in his direction. Eyes gleaming with the desire to do battle, he threw his head back and let loose a long cry. Bring it on. Today, you're all gonna find out exactly how awesome Lord Bai is. With that, he tossed out more soul convergence pills, becoming a streak of light that crushed everything in his path. In the end, the fearsome army of devilish specters was reduced to only a few wandering souls. Any of them that remained would flee as soon as Bai Xiaochun got near. Back when they had swept across the starry sky, they had encountered terrifying opponents, but none of them could match up to Bai Xiaochun, who was like the king of all devils. He had already collected about 30% as many souls as he had collected on his journey through the void. In fact, it was so easy that, in addition to collecting souls, he conjured some flames on the side. With the materials he had on hand, he was able to make all sorts of multicolored flame, sending glittering light out in all directions. Before long, the devilish specters feared Bai Xiaochun more than anyone other than the mortal renegade. They had no real consciousness, but they could sense how dangerous he was, and didn't dare to try to fight against him. They could only wish that they were faster than they were as they fled. On another occasion, Bai Xiaochun might not have been in the mood to go after them, but seeing how much of a fortune was at hand, he headed toward the volcano in the middle of this bound area. Nothing could get in his way, and thus, it was a short time later that he arrived at the volcano, which he immediately scanned with divine sense. Instantly, his eyes lit up with curiosity. Within the volcano was an ancient stone gate. It seemed to radiate a sensation of ancient time, and emanated muffled howls. Actually, it was less of a gate and more of a stone framework, within which was a chaotic, rippling membrane that resembled water. The membrane pulsed in and out, as though something inside of it were struggling to free itself, and enter the bound portion of the world. The sight of it caused Bai Xiaochun's pupils to constrict. However, he soon sensed that whatever was on the other side was merely at the Archean level. Relaxing a bit, he shot toward the volcano. Although the volcano continued to belch black smoke, it didn't affect Bai Xiaochun at all, thanks to the fluctuations which rolled off of him and pushed the smoke away. Therefore, it was like a streak of lightning that he shot into the volcano and appeared right in front of the stone gate. As he did, the entity on the other side seemed to sense his presence, and emitted a howl that could shake heaven and earth. Suddenly, a huge arm stretched out from inside, pushing against the membrane as if to break it. Clearly, this entity was another devilish specter, although it was different from the others of its kind. It was far more powerful, being at the Archean level. Furthermore, its soul body was whole and complete, very different from the Archean soul Bai Xiaochun had acquired from the palace he had encountered out in the void. Apparently, this particular devilish specter was like some sort of general within the mortal renegade's army. Given enough time, it would break through the membrane, and arrive to take control of this area of bound earth. At that point, it would take quite a bit of effort on Bai Xiaochun's part to drive it away. After all, an Archean devilish specter could exert a huge amount of control over the army. And although Bai Xiaochun's soul convergence pills would still work in a situation like that, they would definitely be less effective. Unfortunately for this unlucky Archean specter, not only had Bai Xiaochun arrived much sooner than anyone could have expected, but he also had methods for capturing soul bodies. Therefore, before the devilish specter could even get out into the open, he was there to block its path. Enraged, the devilish specter let out a howl, as well as an icy coldness, as it began to tear at the membrane. Another way that this devilish specter was different from its fellows was that it was conscious, and even had divine sense. "You got lucky this time," the specter shouted in rage. "If my true self were here, I would cut you down where you stand. However, there's no need for you to get cocky. Before long, my master's entire army will arrive, and my true self along with it. We'll fill the lands and take your people to become part of our army of devilish specters." With that, the hand began to sink back down into the membrane. Before it could disappear, however, Bai Xiaochun blinked a few times and then stepped forward. Reaching out, he grabbed the hand, which almost looked like it was gloved, considering how the membrane covered it. "Hey, what's the rush? Since you're here, I can help you." There was no way that Bai Xiaochun was simply going to let an Archean devilish specter escape. It was too valuable. To the shock of the devilish specter, Bai Xiaochun drew upon both his fleshly body power and his cultivation base, unleashing incredible force as he began to drag the arm back out. Bai Xiaochun was actually shockingly strong, especially when he went all out. He even drew upon the sovereign aura in his right arm, which enabled him to easily drag the devilish specter completely out through the stone gate. It happened so quickly that the specter almost couldn't believe what was happening, and didn't even have time to react. In the blink of an eye, he was standing there right in front of Bai Xiaochun. He looked like a middle-aged man with disheveled hair, who now stood there, looking at Bai Xiaochun with a blank look in his eyes. Then he looked down at himself, and if he could have, would have begun to drip with cold sweat. He knew exactly how tough that membrane was. After all, he had been struggling with it in vain for quite some time earlier. Then, along came this skinny, fair-faced young man, who simply ripped it open. Even more importantly, now that he didn't have the stone gate and the membrane to stand between them, he realized that Bai Xiaochun's aura was enough to cause him to tremble physically. Hey, senior," he said, "this is just a misunderstanding." Bai Xiaochun said curiously. "You're a very special type of soul, aren't you?" No, this is all just a misunderstanding." "Calm down, senior. Well, I'll head back now." With that, he spun and lunged for the gate. However, despite the fact that he moved with incredible quickness, he quickly lurched to a halt as Bai Xiaochun grabbed his arm. Then he saw Bai Xiaochun's enigmatic smile, and his face fell. "It was really a misunderstanding," he wailed. I was just shooting my mouth off, that's all." What are you in such a rush for?" Bai Xiaochun interrupted. "It seems to me that the two of us are connected by destiny. You actually talk like me." Clearing his throat, he dragged the devilish specter back. However, that was when the specter suddenly bared fangs and claws, and tried to pounce on Bai Xiaochun. The Archean power brimming within his attack would have been enough to give the Saint Emperor some serious problems. But Bai Xiaochun was different. He wasn't afraid at all of close quarters fighting. "Well, what have we here? Attacking me?" Glaring, Bai Xiaochun pulled out a tongue of multicolored flame and smashed it into the devilish specter, who responded with an agonized shriek. Bai Xiaochun's methods were indeed profoundly harmful to soul bodies. After all, multicolored flame was conjured using souls, and was particularly effective in defeating them. Next, more screams could be heard as Bai Xiaochun continued to vent his anger on the crafty devilish specter. Before long, those screams became pleas for mercy. "I'm sorry, senior. Don't hit me. This was my mistake. Let me go. I just want to go home." The screaming specter was growing weaker by the moment. Eventually, Bai Xiaochun let up a bit, whereupon the specter struggled to crawl back to the stone gate. Halfway there, though, Bai Xiaochun grabbed his leg and dragged him back. "You're not going anywhere. Take this." Glaring, he took another multicolored flame and slammed it into the ground, causing fire to blaze out in all directions. As the fire filled the bound portion of the world, the other devilish specters who were in hiding began to scream as they were destroyed. "I beg of you, let me go home. I can't take this any longer." Terrified, the devilish specter began to wail. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun lifted his foot up and slammed it down into the ground. Booms rang out as the entire bound area began to collapse. The ground was first, then the volcano, and then the stone gate. As the stone gate began to collapse, the Archean specter struggled frantically to reach it, until Bai Xiaochun grabbed him by the leg and dragged him back. Still trying to make a break for it? The devilish specter was so scared that he shivered and then passed out, much to Bai Xiaochun's shock. However, he was obviously a very good specimen, and therefore, he flicked his sleeve and threw him into his bag. Then he looked around at the burning sea of flames that was eating up the entire bound portion of the world. Before long, everything was shattering into fragments. After the largest of the bound world areas vanished, Bai Xiaochun flew up into the air and sent his divine sense out into the rest of the eternal immortal domains, immediately catching sight of the more than 100 smaller nodes rising up like bubbles in different areas. If you likened the eternal immortal domains to a person, then they were like malignant boils, terrifying in appearance, corroding everything within and around them. Expression unsightly, he blurred into motion toward the Arch-Emperor dynasty. Obviously, the Arch-Emperor dynasty was the first thing on his mind. He decimated each of the node worlds he came across with soul convergence pills and seas of flame. He moved without stopping, going from one to another, until almost all of the areas in the Arch-Emperor dynasty were clear. Of course, a few areas were handled by the Grand Heaven Master, Gongsun Wan'er, and other top experts. However, there was no time for rest. Next, they headed to the Vile Emperor dynasty, where they were soon joined by forces from the Saint Emperor. Before long, Bai Xiaochun and the Saint Emperor were working together, excising the malignant boils from the surface of the eternal immortal domains. The eternal immortal domains were now riddled with corroded craters and had lost a significant amount of life force. At the same time, while the mortal renegade didn't look any different from before, close examination would reveal that a certain area on his forehead had begun to shine less brightly than before. The Saint Emperor looked up for a moment, sighed, and then turned to Bai Xiaochun, toward whom he clasped hands and bowed deeply. Arch-Emperor, I will return to the Saint Emperor dynasty to calm my people. Afterward, I will come to your capital city to discuss our next step. He spoke very politely, both in terms of his tone and his wording. Sighing, Bai Xiaochun bid him farewell, then hovered there in the air looking up at the mortal renegade. Considering everything that had happened, he now felt more pressure than ever. He felt like there was a sharp blade hanging right above his head, ready to fall at any moment, unstoppable and impossible to defend against. The Saint Emperor said that the sealing strip would last for half of a 60-year cycle. After what just happened, though, I doubt it will be that long. The fact that the mortal renegade could awaken at any moment filled Bai Xiaochun with an intense sensation of deadly crisis, something that left him feeling very agitated. However, he knew that he couldn't let that show. He needed to comfort and encourage the people of the Arch-Emperor dynasty, especially his friends and family. If that day truly comes, then I'll just have to use my fan to take away as many people as possible. Even that thought provoked a sigh. After all, putting people in the fan wouldn't make them any safer. The only reason the fan still existed was because the mortal renegade had been sealed. Once he woke up, it would be as easy for him to find and destroy it as turning over his own hand. Heart sinking even more than before, Bai Xiaochun finally turned and flew toward the Imperial Palace in Arch-Emperor City. There, the Grand Heaven Master and the other Celestials greeted him with formal bows. Although they didn't have as full of an understanding of the matter as Bai Xiaochun and the Saint Emperor, they knew more than the average cultivator. Furthermore, they also knew that the deadlier the crisis, the more they needed to rely on Bai Xiaochun. Therefore, the greetings they offered were those of complete allegiance, and also, supplications for protection. The giant ghost king had long since been returned, and was now awake. After he found out about everything that had occurred, and learned that the proverbial fuse had been lit with the enormous sovereign in the sky, he shook his head and sighed. Bai Xiaochun stood there quietly, and everyone looked on nervously. Nobody said anything. Zhou Zimo and Song Junwan were there, as was Hu Xiaomei, whose belly was now very large. All of them looked very anxious. After a moment, Bai Xiaochun looked up, and a faint smile could be seen on his face. Don't worry, everyone. Everything will be okay. Everyone present was either very close to Bai Xiaochun, or was a celestial. Most knew what kind of person he was, and the others were the type who wouldn't ask unnecessary questions. After a moment of silence, everyone nodded bitterly. Eventually, they dispersed, wrapped up in confusion, fear, and helplessness. Even the Grand Heaven Master, who was a master of plots and schemes, was powerless to do anything in a situation like this, and seemed to age because of it. Bai Xiaochun merely watched them leave. He wanted to say something, but in the end, was unsure of how to console them, and simply maintained silence. Soon, the only people left in the palace hall were Zhou Zimo, Song Junwan, Hu Xiaomei, and Gongsun Wan'er. When it came to Gongsun Waner, the other three women had long since realized that she had some sort of special relationship with Bai Xiaochun. Although Song Junwan and Zhou Zimo had initially excluded her, Hu Xiaomei had struggled with the matter for a while, until she came to the conclusion that having her master in the group with them would benefit her. And now, in a moment of impending crisis, and facing an unknowable future, Song Junwan and Zhou Zimo exchanged a glance, sighed, and finally accepted Gongsun Waner. The time they had left was limited, and Bai Xiaochun knew that a catastrophe was coming that he couldn't easily resolve. Originally, he had assumed that the pressure would be terrifying. However, with all the women around him, he suddenly realized that he wasn't as frightened as he had thought he would be. Actually, he realized that he missed them, and in fact, was a bit guilty that most of his time in the eternal immortal domains had been spent on cultivation, and on establishing the Arch-Emperor dynasty. For a long time, he had worried that people would see through the fact that much of his supposed strength was a sham, which could lead to the downfall of the nation. Because of that, he had remained completely focused on cultivation. Whether it was for the purpose of resurrecting Bai Hao, or for reaching the Archean realm, he had worked so hard, that he had forgotten the most important thing of all. Family. Forget that there had been a multitude of reasons, in the end, he had not paid enough attention to his family. He had not spent time with them. Perhaps without impending catastrophe, he would not have realized it. And maybe if he had realized it, he would never have been able to find the right balance between cultivation and family. Men often bear the responsibility to deal with such matters, and with a personality like Bai Xiaochun's, that became an even more difficult task. Now, disaster loomed, and time was very limited. And sadly, it was only in those circumstances that he became aware of his oversight. Sighing, he stepped forward to embrace all four of the women. "How are Dabao and Xiaoxiao?" he asked softly. As a father, it felt strange to need to ask such a question, and only went to further reinforce how much his cultivation had taken him away, not only from his Taoist partners, but also his children. "They're both in secluded meditation," Song Junwan replied quietly. Bai Xiaochun sent some divine sense out, and soon located the two private chambers where Dabao and Xiaoxiao were. It had been a few years since he had last seen them. During his journey in the void, he had occasionally returned, but had never been able to spend a lot of time with them. Both of them were still young, but in terms of their cultivation, they had access to the rich spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the eternal immortal domains, as well as innumerable precious materials. On top of that, they were spectacularly talented to begin with. Although both of them were roughly in their 20s, Xiaoxiao was already attempting to break through into the celestial realm. She was very much the daughter of Bai Xiaochun and Song Junwan, and had inherited merits from both. She was incredibly beautiful, and also very quick-witted. A single glance at her, and anyone would realize she was both imaginative and calculating. Dabao was a bit behind his older sister, being in the great circle of the demigod realm. He looked very much like his father, but no one would describe him as being quick-witted like his sister. He took things slowly. From his chiseled good looks, it was possible to see how tenacious and persistent he was. In fact, one good way to describe him was a Bai Xiaochun who wasn't afraid of dying. Upon catching sight of his son and daughter with divine sense, Bai Xiaochun smiled. Then he focused his attention on his four Taoist partners, and his gaze eventually came to rest on Hu Xiaomei's swollen belly. Clearly, she was reaching her due date. He had long since come to sense the fluctuations of his own blood within Hu Xiaomei, and now that he was looking at her, she blushed slightly and wrapped her arms around her belly. Smiling, he stepped forward and embraced her. "I've already thought of a good name," he said. As soon as the words left his mouth, Hu Xiaomei became visibly nervous. Song Junwan and Zhou Zimo both blinked in consternation, and Gongsun Waner's eyes widened into a glare. Voice as hard as iron, Gongsun Waner said, "There's no need for you to worry about coming up with a name." In response, Hu Xiaomei sighed with relief. Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat a few times, looked around at the women, and decided that now was not the time to discuss this sensitive matter. And thus, the days began to pass. For Bai Xiaochun, it reminded him of his early days in the Spirit Stream sect. He ignored cultivation, and everything else for that matter, choosing instead to be with his Taoist partners, and keep watch over Dabao and Xiaoxiao. He also spent time with Big Fatty Zhang and his other friends. Of course, he also spent time reminiscing with Li Qinghao and some of the other members of the older generation. 3 months later, Hu Xiaomei went into labor. Although Song Junwan, Zhou Zimo, and even Gongsun Waner had done everything they could to prevent Bai Xiaochun from proceeding with his naming plan, he was the Arch-Emperor, and could not easily be stopped. He had already secretly crafted an identity medallion for his new child, with the name engraved on its surface. And as soon as the child was born, he immediately had the name announced publicly. Because of how famous he was, the news immediately spread through the Arch-Emperor dynasty, and by the time the women heard, it was too late to do anything about it. That's it, Bai Xiaochun. You're dead. What kind of a name is that, Bai Xiaochun? Xiaobao? Why you're giving your son almost the same name as yourself? 1. Gongsun Wan'er was enraged, and as for Song Junwan and Zhou Zimo, when they thought about the names of their own children, they were similarly angered. Hey, Bai Xiaochun said courageously, isn't Xiaoxiao a good name? And so is Dabao. It all makes sense. My oldest son will be Dabao, and the youngest will be Xiaobao. See? They're both treasures. As far as Bai Xiaochun was concerned, he was the father, and therefore, he had the right to pick names for his children. And that was especially true considering how amazing his own name was. The arguments over the name, and the very birth of Bai Xiaobao, temporarily relieved some of the pressure weighing down on the Arch-Emperor dynasty. People began to smile and laugh again, even the Grand Heaven Master and other important officials. The giant ghost king, Li Qinghao, and the other celestials all breathed a sigh of relief when they saw tensions in the nation being eased. Gongsun Wan'er, Song Junwan, and Zhou Zimo all realized that what was done was done. Considering that Bai Xiaochun had announced the name publicly, it couldn't be changed. And Hu Xiaomei simply sighed. Stroking her child's cheek, she thought about it, and came to the conclusion that she could accept a name like that. Feeling very pleased with himself, Bai Xiaochun took Xiaobao in his arms and began to rock him back and forth. Xiaobao was a bit different from his siblings. He did not inherently possess the undying codex like Dabao, nor did he have the live forever codex like Xiaoxiao. However, he did possess the aura of a Dao body. Most people would not be able to see that, but Bai Xiaochun noticed with a single glance. It was definitely a Dao body, just like the one the worldly Taoist had possessed. When it came to cultivation, possessing a Dao body meant that the cultivator could progress rapidly with almost no obstacles or bottlenecks. Although Bai Xiaochun was shocked by this development, he didn't mention it to anyone. Xiaobao's personality became evident almost as soon as he was born. From the way he looked around with his wide eyes, Bai Xiaochun realized that Xiaobao had most likely inherited his very dependable personality. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.